This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices and thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I'm Joel Ansami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Srdoc, economist, co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. We're pleased to have with us this weekend Dr. Walter E. Williams. Dr. Williams has served on the faculty of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, as the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics since 1980. From 1995 to 2001, he served as department chairman. He has also served on the faculties of Los Angeles City College, California State University, Los Angeles, Temple University in Philadelphia, and Grove City College, Grove City, Pennsylvania. Dr. Williams is a syndicated columnist and an author of 10 books, including Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism, South Africa's War Against Capitalism, Up from the Projects, an autobiography, and Race and Economics. How much can be blamed on discrimination? We extend to you, sir, a warm welcome on America's Roundtable.
Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Your extraordinary work in explaining economics has gone beyond a university classroom full of students to educating and informing our fellow Americans through your writings, your substituting assignment for one of America's top talk show hosts, reaching millions of listeners nationwide, and your regular appearances on broadcast media. Dr. Walter Williams, when reviewing our nation's fiscal crisis and the concerns expressed that we're about to enter a recession if the grave issues at hand are not sincerely addressed, it would be beneficial to address a more fundamental issue. Dr. Williams, what would you put forward as the legitimate role of government in a free society?
Well, I think it's very clear. The founders gave us the legitimate role of government in the United States Constitution. That's our rules of the game. That's what Congress imagined or envisioned that the federal government would be doing. And all of it's listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And essentially, the role of government in a legitimate role of government in a free society is to mostly to prevent one person from violating the property rights of another. And when I say property rights, I mean, I'm perfectly general with that, because you yourself, your body, we each belong to ourselves. And so the role of government is, and the framers viewed the role of the federal government as being very limited. And if you look at Federalist Paper 45, which was written by James Madison, the acknowledged father of the Constitution, he says in there, I'm virtually quoting him, he says that trying to explain the powers delegated to the federal government in order to get the states to ratify the Constitution. And he said that the powers that we've given the federal government are few and well-defined and restricted mostly to external affairs. Those powers left with the states and the people are indefinite and numerous. Now, if you would turn that upside down, you'd have what we have today. That is, the powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous, and those of the people and the states are restricted. And so we've gone far beyond the legitimate role of the federal government and the United States Congress envisioned by the founders. I might just say one other thing, is that our founders had a deep, deep distrust for the United States Congress. Mm-hmm. Just look at the language of the language that they use in the Bill of Rights. It says, Congress shall not disparage. Congress shall not infringe. Congress shall not prohibit. Congress shall not violate. Now, I told people that when we die and at our next destination, if we see anything like the Bill of Rights, we know that we are in hell. Because a Bill of Rights in heaven would be an insult to God.
Right, indeed. In fact, Dr. Williams, in a recent piece titled Future Generations, you place the spotlight on the federal government's opaque and questionable financial statements when compared to that of business and nonprofit enterprises. You succinctly state that enterprises are required by law to produce financial statements, specifically their present and expected future liabilities. And you penned the following statement, I quote, By contrast, the federal government gets by without having to provide transparent and honest financial statements. The U.S. Treasury's balance sheet does list liabilities such as public debt, but it does not include the massive unfunded liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, and other federal future obligations. And you mentioned that a conservative estimate of Washington's unfunded liabilities for the year ending 2011 is $87 trillion. That's more than 500% of our 2011 GDP of $15 trillion, unquote. Dr. Williams, how serious are our problems when we look at our American economy?
Our problems are very, very serious, and we're headed in the direction of an economic collapse. And just look at the magnitude of the problem. That is, Congress has made many promises through Social Security and Medicare that there are no reserves against. And in order for Congress to meet all of the promises that it's made, let's say up to 2070 or 2080, it would have to put $6 trillion in the bank today, earning about a 4 or 5% rate of interest. Congress is not going to do that. And so, and in other words, and I also point out in the column that Washington would have to, or Congress would have to, collect about $8 trillion in tax revenue, not to pay off our debt, but to stop our debt from getting larger. That is, they would have to collect today, this year, $8 trillion in tax revenues, and just to stop the debt from getting larger and larger. And to put that in perspective, that if the IRS or the Congress just took all the earnings of people making more than $66,000 and took all the corporate profit, which comes to about $1.6 trillion, they still could not. I'm sorry. It comes to the corporate $1.6 trillion. They still could not raise enough money to stop us from going further and further into debt.
Interestingly enough, President Obama was talking about the importance of math or arithmetic, and he communicated that at the National Convention a few months ago and was very proud of the fact that he could add numbers together. Well, the interesting thing is that just recently, as we've been looking at some of these statistics and facts, and there's been a myth that by taxing the rich and, say, collecting some $87 billion, we'll be able to solve the problems without yet addressing some of the fundamental issues of federal spending. And for our listeners, it's important for them to realize that $87 billion will disappear in just 8 days. So we're really
that's right. And that's right. And because the federal government or Congress spends about a little bit less than $10 billion a day. So that would last us, as you said, about 8 or 9 days. And matter of fact, if you just took all the earnings from Americans, I'm talking about all of the earnings, we could not solve our problems, because the big problem in our nation is spending. That is, federal revenues since 1960, they range between 15 and 20% of the GDP. And so no matter whether tax rates were 91% or 35%, the tax revenues to the federal government were no more than 15 to 20% of the GDP. But the big problem is spending. Spending has grown to 25% and more of the GDP. And so if we do not address the big spending programs, everything else is for naught.
It's truly very disconcerting to hear the spending that is taking place here in Washington, D.C. And a few weeks ago, we had U.S. Senator Tom Coburn. And Senator Coburn communicated about his book, his annual published report, which is Waste Book, and where he outlined some $20 billion in government waste, fraud, and duplication. And it's interesting to note that Dr. Coburn stated that there's some $300 billion in the budget today that are basically wasted due to waste, fraud, and duplication.
Well, yeah, that is surely true, but it's not our major problem. That is, if you look at three spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, they represent 50% of federal spending. And so any politician not getting serious, talking about doing something with those programs, he's not serious at all. But see, here's the problem. That is, the beneficiaries of Medicaid and Social Security, they vote in large numbers. There are people over 65 years old. They vote in large numbers, and any politician talking about touching those programs, he's in deep political trouble. But and so they rather focus, and I think it's important to focus on waste and abuse and fraud in government. But that's just a drop in the bucket. Matter of fact, if Coburn says it's $300 billion, well, that's just 30 days worth of spending.
Wow. Well, in one of your speeches delivered in 1994, you warned that the U.S. was approaching a national debt of $5 trillion with $300 billion deficits a year. And you also warned then that that was not all, and it was significantly understated. And then you continued by saying all federal obligations, including Social Security, government retirement guarantees, loans, we would be talking about something closer to $16 trillion. Well, today it is a $16 trillion national debt with more than 100% of GDP, with $1.1 trillion budget deficit in 2012. And these figures, as you mentioned, do not include unfunded liabilities of Medicare, Social Security, and other obligations which exceed $86.8 trillion. You mentioned about politicians going against Medicare, Social Security would be ousted by their electorate. But when and how are we going to reverse this trend, which is getting worse and unsustainable?
Well, I don't know whether we can reverse it, and that is, a lot of people will have said to me down through the years. They say, well, what can we do about our country? And so I said, well, look, are Americans as human beings, are we any way basically different from the Romans, from the Spanish, from the Portuguese, from the French, from the Britons? And I just listed some great empires of the past that went down the tubes. And I say, no, we're not that different. And so, we're doing the same thing that those great nations of the past did. If you look at Greece right now, Greece, their debt to GDP ratio is 180%, and no signs of improvement. Wow. In 1974. In the United States, our debt ratio to GDP was 34%. Our debt was 34% of GDP. Today, our debt is 105% of GDP. That is, we are moving in the directions of the bankrupt countries in Europe. And I don't see any reversal. Even if we had a Republican president, I doubt whether there'd be a reversal. And I hate to sound pessimistic about it, but, my daughter and husband, my daughter married a few months ago, and I was talking to her husband. I said, the best thing you guys can do is try to get $30,000 or $40,000 worth of gold coins. Don't keep them in a bank, and not for investment, but as a doomsday scenario to have enough money to get out of our country.
Well, it's interesting that you've just mentioned that there was a group of immigrants that got together some few months ago, and it was interesting to hear one of them communicate saying that here is my father who came to this country some, 4 decades ago, and he came to America because of America's economic freedom, individual liberty, political freedom, and so forth. He said, well, my wife is pregnant and we're expecting a child, but it seems that my son may have to return to my father's land just because we no longer have the liberties, the economic freedom, or the economic conditions for this person to survive in this country here. So you're certainly right.
That's right. And if you look at the most recent index of economic freedom published by the Heritage Foundation and Fraser Institute in Canada, they point out that United States, I believe that we've slipped down to number 9 in terms of economic freedom. And Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and New Zealand and Australia, they're ahead of us.
The question is, this is definitely not the free market. We're not living anymore in a free market capitalism, which you described as punishing people who do not please their fellow man and use their resources efficiently. We've seen companies being bailed out and being accountable to government, not to consumers anymore. We need to see actually going back to the free markets today. Can we do that?
I don't know. And matter of fact, next week I'll have a column out talking about John Allison's new book, which is the title is The Financial Crisis and the Free Market Cure. And one of the things he says, we would not have the kind of crony capitalism that we have now if there was a separation between the state and business, just like there's a separation between the state and the church. He was saying there ought to be a separation of state and business, because these big businesses, they hire thousands, tens of thousands of lobbyists in Washington, and they give huge financial contributions. And what they're doing, they're looking for favors, they're looking for subsidies, looking for handouts. And they sold us on the idea that they're too big to fail. And I don't think any company's too big to fail. I think that in a free market, making profit is very, very important, and making losses is very important, because profits tell you that you're serving your fellow man very well and you're doing it in a efficient way. Losses say you're not serving your fellow man, and or you're not doing it in the most efficient way. And so when you bail companies out, when the government comes out, bails out GM or Chrysler, it's in effect saying, well, look, you can keep on screwing up your customers and giving favors to labor unions and using inefficient practices. We won't let you be accountable to consumers and investors. Just be accountable to us. I asked myself, I say, well, does government do things that if I did the identical thing, I would get arrested or I'd be convicted as a thief? Now, for example, what I mean by that is that I could see an elderly lady laying in downtown Washington, and she's hungry, she needs medical attention, and she needs some shelter. And I could walk up to one of you guys and take your $200, and then having gotten your $200, I can go down and buy the lady some medical attention, some food, and some shelter. Would I be guilty of a crime? Of course I'd be guilty of a crime, because I've taken the rightful property of one person and given it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, most Americans can agree with me on that. Now, so I asked, well, would it still be wrong if 3 people agreed that I should take your money, or 10 people, or 1 million people, or 300 million people? It wouldn't make any difference. It's still theft. And when the Congress takes your money to give it to help out an older, a needy person, well, the only difference is that when I took it, that's illegal theft, and when Congress takes it, it's legalized theft. Now, the listeners should not get me wrong. I believe in helping one's fellow man in need. And I think that by reaching into one's own pockets to help one's fellow man in need, that's praiseworthy and laudable. And reaching in somebody else's pockets to help one's fellow man in need, that's worthy of condemnation and is despicable. And for the Christians among us, I think that when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, he did not mean thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress.
For those who have joined us on America's Roundtable, we're delighted to have as one of our featured guests this weekend, Dr. Walter E. Williams. And Dr. Williams has served on the faculty of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, as the John M. Olin Distinguished Fellow, a distinguished professor of economics since 1980.
Dr. Williams, do you see a possibility of certain reforms that would help bring more of a free market back and against crony capitalism, such as campaign financing reform, also perhaps banning omnibus legislation, which results in thousands of pages that have to be decided on just one vote, and those pages are really having a number of special interest group articles and favors in it, and also introducing perhaps new checks and balances that could not have been provisioned 300 years ago, but are needed today, as you said, also perhaps to separate the state from corporations.
Well, it's very difficult, and one of the reasons is, let me just give you a very, very brief example. Take, for instance, the sugar industry. it pays them, both the people, the owners and the employees, to contribute, to give financial resources so that they can go and lobby for Washington to keep out foreign sugar so they can get higher prices of sugar, and therefore earn higher profits and higher wages. Okay, so that's the benefit side of it. But the cost side is borne by millions of Americans who have to pay $10 more a year for the sugar that they use. Now, for those millions of Americans who have to pay $10 more for their sugar, I mean, it's very costly to organize them, and a lot of people will say, well, I'm not going to go down Washington and fight the congressman. I'll just pay the $10 more a year for sugar and just, be on with my life. But, however, the sugar industry, they will focus their energy and try to unseat a congressman who does not vote for tariffs on foreign sugar. So it's a problem that economists call, it's a widely dispersed cost. That is all the Americans have to pay high $10 more for sugar versus narrow, well-defined interests, namely the people in the sugar industry. Now, so the sugar industry is just one example, perhaps among millions, and so there's this problem of getting Congress to be responsive to do what's in the best interest of Americans in general, rather than do what's in the best interest of particular Americans or special interest groups.
Right. Dr. Williams, Balkanization became a negative term based on the events that transpired in the Balkan region. And my roots are from Eastern Europe, and I witnessed the violent secession firsthand in the former Yugoslavia. Secession, which was provisioned in the Constitution, I must say. Most of the attention was given to ethnic tensions. However, the separation of these sovereign states, once belonging to Yugoslavia, was triggered by dire economic conditions, fueled by corrupt politicians of an authoritarian regime and fiscal irresponsibility. It was clear for us then that separation became the solution in 1991. In your recent column, you talked about secession. What are your thoughts about America's independent states in placing secession as a last resort to the federal government's directives, from healthcare to burdensome regulation and now fiscal mismanagement?
I think that secession is very, very important. I think that, the right to secede. Back in 1787, the Constitution would have never been ratified if states did not believe that they could secede from the Union. As a matter of fact, a number of state ratification conventions, such as Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York, they explicitly said that they had the right to resume the powers that they originally had. Now, there came a very bitter war in 1861 when 11 southern states seceded from unions. And the issue of secession was settled through brute force that led to 600,000 lives, the cost of 600,000 lives. So Abraham Lincoln, he settled the issue of whether states can secede. Now, when you say that states cannot secede, well then what that means is that the federal government can do anything it wants to the states, because the states have no recourse except to just to obey the federal government. It's very much like if you told a woman that she can't divorce her husband, well then that means her husband can treat her any way that he wants. But exit is a very, very important tool in order to get cooperation among people and get people to obey contracts.
Exactly. Yes, I believe that secession is an ultimate protection of sovereignty of the states and check on the power, as you mentioned, of the federal government.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And Americans had done it before. We seceded from King George, in 1776.
Indeed, and in fact, I imagine that a number of the citizens of the United Kingdom would probably beg to differ on the reasons of separation now that we have a full representative body here with a taxation or a tax system that is very punitive of our fellow American citizens.
Yeah, right. And I was giving a lecture in Great Britain, and I was chatting, and then so one of the guys asked me, Walter Williams, well, where do you live? I said, well, I live around Valley Forge. That's where that's where you people ran George Washington. He came out the next winter and ran you guys out of the country. And so it was Lord Harris of High Cross who I was talking to. He said, well, yes, you fellows were upset about taxation without representation. He says, how do you feel about it with representation?
Right, yes, indeed. And it's certainly, when you think about it, it's no laughing matter when we think about the significant fiscal crisis we're in. And in all sincerity, there really isn't much negotiating at all. In fact, there was even not much discussion taking place between the administration and leaders of the House and the Senate on resolving some of these very serious issues facing us as American citizens.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And what are your thoughts about what may transpire in the next few weeks? Are we going to see a settlement in the sense of a deal brokered, or are we going to, as people have communicated, take the plunge and end up in a recession? If I knew the answer to that, I'd be very, very wealthy because I could take a long or short position in the stock market. Right. And so I don't. So, matter of fact, when I always tell people, if you want some guesses about the future, always ask rich people. Don't ask me. We thank you so much for your time, Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at AmericasRT. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.